Hello and welcome to Dead Times, the only horror movie podcast recorded inside the archives of a major motion picture studio. I'm your host Peter, and with me as always is the guy playing me in the movie version of this podcast, Tim. Tim, how you doing?
Oh, well, you know how it is, Silent Bob. I can't complain about too much.
Uh, if you can't tell, today we are going to be talking about Scream 3, which is a Hollywood satire more than anything else. Uh,
Yeah,
so what were your initial thoughts about Scream 3?
it's really good. It's for one, it is a parade of people that I like showing up.
Hmm.
There is Jay and Silent Bob for a minute. Patrick Warburton is in this movie, which made me very happy because he's one of the only people that I can do a convincing impression.
Parker Posey is in this movie. Lance
Yes,
Lance Henriksen is in this movie. It is an interesting cast.
and Jamie Kennedy returns from beyond the grave,
That he does.
which just felt like it flowed so naturally with the rest of the movie. But we'll
Yeah.
we'll get into that. I thought it was really fun. I thought it was slightly more fun than Scream 2, but
Mhm.
not quite as well made as the first one.
In my opinion, which again, take this for a grain of salt, this is the worst Scream movie, but there's so much love about it that I can't complain that much about it. Um,
Yeah, and it has weaknesses, and it's
yeah, like I can totally see how someone would rank this as the best Scream movie. But just for me, there are things about it that don't work as well as some of the stuff in Scream 1 and 2.
it's probably the soapiest of all three.
Oh yeah. Let's get started with the prologue. As we know, every Scream movie has a prologue, and this one is interesting because it actually involves a character who we already have been introduced to in the series.
Yeah, and I didn't like that. I
Hmm.
mean, as a sequence, it works fine. As the start to any other movie, it would be a perfectly fine way to start.
Hmm.
But the fact that it's somebody we recognize did kind of bother me. That I was like, this isn't how you're supposed to start a Scream movie.
The prologue features Cotton Weary, who was the man Sydney accused of raping and murdering her mother in the first movie, and then was her creepy ally in the second movie who just wanted people to pay attention to him. And then in this movie, he's turned himself into like a weird right wing talk show host.
Yeah, I want to see that movie. I feel like we're missing some key information about the life of Cotton Weary here.
Yeah. So he's a weird talk show host, and he gets a phone call from an attractive woman, which sets up sort of the innovation of this movie, which is that the killer can use multiple voices as opposed to just the one.
Yeah, the innovation of this movie is the fact that it's a science fiction movie because that technology does not exist. Or certainly does not exist in portable, non-digital fashion.
Which the prologue also sets up what the killer's main objective with the murders is, which is he's trying to contact Sydney and find out where she is. Which I thought it was interesting that they were so clear about that's what the killer wants right there up front.
Yeah,
He's
and it makes sort of, and it's funny because it makes some sense because putting that together was sort of part of the second movie. So it makes sense. Okay, this time around we'd be able to just infer this. We can as an audience, and so can the characters.
the killer attacks Cotton's girlfriend because the killer's in Cotton's house and pretending to be Cotton as he's attacking her. Which apparently they play some sort of weird sex game as the stabbed killer.
Yeah, which
Mhm.
just seems like it's inviting trouble at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Cotton gets home, his girlfriend gets murdered, then he gets murdered. So what do you think about the prologue?
I think it works fine as the start to the movie, but I guess the sort of the break with tradition, which isn't even made that big of a deal of having it be about a character that we already know, a minor character, sure,
Mhm.
and somebody who still dies and isn't part of the rest of the movie. But yeah, the fact that it's about somebody that we have some setup for,
Mhm.
rather than just being this sort of mini. Because the other two prologues, the prologues for Scream 1 and 2, did sort of function as short films, and they were this really cool sort of quick tour of the beats of a horror movie squeezed into like 10 or 12 minutes,
Mhm.
which I thought was really really cool. And as sort of standalone thing, it works fine. It's still suspenseful and it's still good filmmaking. But having it be connected with something we had already seen did sort of nag at me a little bit. And I guess in the second one, because the second one has a ghost face killer, and so we recognize that image having seen the first one. But you could have, you could watch the first 10 minutes of Scream 2 not having seen Scream 1, and it would still work just as well on its own. This wouldn't. In order for this to have the impact they were intending, it requires that you've seen both of the previous Scream movies to really understand who Cotton Weary is.
Yeah, I pretty much agree. Considering the fact that this movie is obsessed with going back to revisiting the previous Scream movies, I think it makes a lot of sense that they chose Cotton to be killed up front. I mean, Cotton isn't exactly an emotionally important character. He's just kind of important in the fact that he's been this character that's been in the periphery from the previous two movies. So if you're looking for a character that ties back to that, Cotton's kind of it. That can be easily offed. I mean, like, you could not, as an audience member, I would definitely not accept Gale or Dewey, for example, filling this role.
No. But Cotton isn't even really much of an active presence in the first Scream movie. That was more in the second movie.
Yeah.
And also, like, on the one hand, I get it because Cotton wouldn't have really fit in this movie. And so you would have had to you couldn't write him into this story. There's really no room for him. You would have dragged it down and overcomplicated it, I think. There are other excuses you could have had for him not being around. So I don't know. Again, it works fine in the movie. It just sort of bothers me a little bit conceptually.
So the bulk of this movie takes place during the production of Stab 3. Were you surprised that Stab was coming back in such a huge fashion?
A little bit, and my main question about it, as I'm sure yours was as well, was what were the events of Stab 2 if this is Stab 3, but the Stab movies are based on the events that we've seen?
I'm not sure how clear they make it in this movie, but in the Scream 4, they state that the Stab movies are based on Gale's book, that she wrote a second book about the events at Windsor College. It was the basis of Stab 2. And it does make it's very, very weird that they took what is ostensibly a historical film about real incidents and real people, and then they're now just doing a fictional slasher movie inspired by those, but still including the real people.
Yeah, and just calling it Stab 3. Like, it's still yeah, that's particularly ridiculous. Like, this franchise takes some, it plays fast and loose with realism in a lot of ways, but that's particularly ridiculous.
I know. Well, it sort of sets up there. Like I said, this movie is more of a Hollywood satire than anything, and it is very much a satire of Hollywood that they would be like, all right, well, there aren't more killings to make movies off of, so let's just invent more killings.
Yeah, but they don't even call attention to that. Like there's like that one scene when they're going over the script, like who dies next in the script, and someone, the actress playing what's her face points at Gale and says, "You do," and she's all upset about it. She's like, "I die in Stab 3," but nobody really brings up how fucking weird that is. How did they get? Isn't that illegal in some way to make a movie in which actual currently alive people are spectacularly killed by a slasher movie villain? Without their permission, without even asking them?
I'm assuming that I do not know enough about life rights contract law to tell you, but I'm assuming that when Gale sold the original book to be adapted, she sold her life rights, and I don't know how much that extends to everyone else involved.
I don't know. I'm not a lawyer either. That seems.
But yeah, that seems an incredible poor taste.
Yeah, and that seems like it would be pretty hard to get away with.
So let's start talking about our central threesome now. We're down one. What did you think about Sydney in this movie?
I think when she's in it, it's really good. I was slightly disappointed that for all of Randy's speech about how this is all tying back to the original ordeal that Sydney went through, and it does, but sort of screen time wise, this is really more Gale and Dewey's movie, which is fine. I love watching those characters, but it did feel this time around like Sydney was a little marginalized, And like Gale and Dewey were given more screen time in Scream 2 than they had in the first movie by a
Mhm.
lot, but that felt a little more balanced. It felt more like an
Mhm.
ensemble, with Sydney at the center. Whereas here, like Sydney started to feel a little bit like a supporting character to me. It course corrects a bit in the third act as the shit starts to go down, and especially in the denouement, that felt like a really sort of fitting place to leave Sydney's character. But I did wish that she had a little more screen time the first half of the movie.
Yeah, I think that I agree with your point, but I think that what this movie does that's very intelligent is that it builds off of where Sydney's natural character arc would be. We comment on the fact that in Scream 2 she was a little more paranoid, she was seen to be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and that she was a lot more jittery, even if she was sort of the same strong, smart character that she was in Scream 1, that the natural conclusion of what her life would be to basically isolate herself as much as possible.
And again, that's something that I've enjoyed a lot about this franchise. That every time we revisit all the characters, but Sydney in particular, it really feels like the life they have now is a really natural reaction to the events of previous movie or movies in this case. So yeah, I did really appreciate that.
I do think that the movie suffers somewhat for keeping Sydney out of the action for as long as it does, but when Sydney shows up, I think it is spectacular.
Yes, yeah, I would agree.
Let's move on to Dewey. Got any thoughts about Dewey?
Uh, Poor Dewey, man. He's just always, even more than Sydney in a weird way. Like every time we pick up on what Dewey's been up to, he just seems like he's just kind of shouldering along, just kind of trying to make the best of things. Well, one of the things I really like about this movie is that, which is fitting with how it ends, is that Dewey and Gale's character arcs feel more sort of synced. Like it feels like most of their development in the movie is how they develop in relation to each other. Whereas in the previous two movies, there was a lot of that, but there was also a lot of them sort of on their own, a lot of their own issues, their own personality quirks.
Yeah,
So I like that a lot.
what I like about this movie is that it sort of puts you back to where Dewey and Gale were at the start of Scream 2, which is that they're very antagonistic towards each other, and then gradually reveals that their relationship with each other is so much more complicated than sort of you are initially led to believe.
Yes.
That instead of sort of Gale, as she did in the second movie, that she wrote this book that wasn't very flattering towards Dewey, that what happened was that she had helped Dewey recover from his injuries from the first two movies for a year, I believe it said. Then at that point she got some job opportunities and wanted to leave Woodsboro, and Dewey didn't. And that became the impasse that sort of broke up their relationship, which I think, in my opinion, I'm a little bit even more sympathetic towards Gale out of this situation, because I mean, she can't be expected to, like, basically just give up her career and live in Woodsboro and be a housewife. And Dewey comes off as sort of inflexible in all of this.
Yeah, and that's and again that fits with what we understand of their dynamic based on the previous two movies, especially the second one. Yeah, that it really seems like that Dewey, for all of his wonderful points, is a bit of a mule, who probably would feel pretty uncomfortable trying to keep up with Gale's career. And it makes sense because you got the sense that from the other two movies that the reason they were so kind of perfect for each other is because they were so different.
Mm-hmm.
But those differences in the other two movies really just explained their antagonism towards each other, whereas in this movie, those differences become actual issues that they actually have to sort of hash out a little bit.
The previous two movies, they were just people who were sort of flirting with each other.
Yeah.
And we talked about it in the first movie. There is an open question in the first movie about how much Gale is interested in Dewey versus how much she just wants information from him. Like, obviously, we've now seen that there was an underlying attraction there, but we can't entirely be sure of sort of what their motivations are in this sort of mutual flirtation. Well, now they've had a relationship, and those underlying conflicts that sort of that provided this sort of the playful banter of the previous two movies, well, now they have to actually deal with those. And I think it's actually really believable that they tried it and they just could not come to sort of a working, or could not resolve sort of the internal conflicts between Dewey wanting to be a small town police officer and Gale wanting to be a jet-setting journalist.
Yeah, it makes, that is exactly what you would have imagined would have happened between them. So it is cool that, again, that their sort of differing personalities are something they actually have to work through, rather than something that just, is preventing them from having that first kiss. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. I love that Gale, is now is pretty successful and is has this book that everybody knows about that's being adapted into these high profile, although ethically questionable movies, but still everywhere she goes people hate her.
Yeah.
She's still this pariah, to use a word that the villain of this movie doesn't know about. No matter where she goes, everybody's like, fuck this person.
Well, one of my favorite things in this movie is 100% the incredibly awkward hug that Sydney gives Gale.
Yes.
That is amazingly awkward.
Yeah, both are. Okay, I guess we gotta be allies now at this point. So.
They clearly aren't friends, but they're people who have survived with each other's help for so long. And it's like, well, okay, I guess we've got to friendly greet each other.
And then not exchange word one for the rest of the movie, really.
Yeah. Although again, I like the fact that it sort of is pretty a natural sort of continuation of what Gale and Sydney's relationship has been for all these movies, is that they have this mutual dislike of each other, where Gale seems to take joy in antagonizing Sydney, and Sydney just outright loathes her, and yet they have consistently had to work together, and consistently they've saved each other's lives. And it's like, you can't really.
Yeah, and on some level they both probably are really glad that the other one is still hanging in there. They won't, they don't particularly wish each other, to come to a bad end, but they still are clearly not on the best of terms.
So do you have any other thoughts on Gale in this movie?
Again, for most of it, Gale and Dewey are kind of operating as a unit. So, I just I really enjoyed their dynamic, and this even more than the last one. It seemed like, because in this one, Gale is never she is at the very, very start, but for most of it she's clearly not chasing a story. She just wants to see this done, which I thought was really cool. And again, that's something we've sort of built to, from the first movie, where that was clearly her only motivation really throughout just about the entire thing, to the second movie, where that was part of her motivation, but she also seemed like, this is, probably the right thing to do, whatever that means. To where in this movie, where she's, she really is just one of the good guys and really wants to stop people from dying, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, she does not have a cameraman this movie. They outright say that she
probably couldn't find one who would work for it.
They outright say that she is anchoring an entertainment news show, but in this movie, Gale which is obviously the product of multiple good movies dealing with her character, but she's much more humanized, much more sympathetic, and much more compassionate towards at least the people she likes.
Yeah, but without, she doesn't feel like a different character. It feels absolutely like an extension and a possibility from that horrible tabloid reporter that we had in the first movie.
Yeah, I mean, what this franchise does so well, better than kind of any other horror movie franchise, is that all these characters are traveling on these wonderful narrative arcs, and they all make complete sense about where they wind up.
Because it's a trilogy, as Randy explains to us.
As we've talked about with each of them, they're still clearly the same character as they were in the first movie, but they've changed so much and have such sort of rich lives.
Yeah, and again, and have a lot of sort of ongoing struggles that aren't directly related to the events of the movies. Gale and Dewey learning how to, accept each other and be okay with each other. Some of that involves the time that they've spent together, avoiding and defeating crazy ghost space killers, but a lot of it really has to do with the people that they were before any of that started and continue to be, which is really, really fascinating. It's the story of this section in the lives of characters who go through a lot of stuff that you can make horror movies about, but that's not why they exist. They're carrying on trajectories that they had before slasher movies started happening to them.
And that's why I love Scream so much, is because of the fact that these characters are so rich and so developed and so complicated. Like, there are certainly characters that are rich and developed and complicated in horror movies, lots of them, but this is sort of the only franchise that really just movie after movie develops its core cast so well, which I think is why Neve Campbell and David Arquette and Courtney Cox have come back movie after movie to do this.
Yeah, because who would turn down a chance to be any of these characters again? Mm-hmm. And who would read the script for the next one and not want to give that evolution or that closure to that character that you play?
Which, I mean, not a major plot point, but a plot point in this movie is the fact that they recast a bunch of characters for Stab 3.
Yes.
Because Tori Spelling and David Schwimmer did not want to do another one. Poor Stab. That is a troubled franchise.
Yeah, and I've already vented all of my things about those movies.
Well, what do you think about the characters who were playing well, and the guy playing the obvious Randy Meeks character is not Randy Meeks, but a nearly identical one? What do you think about?
Yeah, they talk about that. I'm an homage.
Yeah, what do you think about all the characters that were actors portraying our main characters?
I thought they were really fun. Most of them don't have too much to do. Most of them are in only a couple scenes, aside from the person playing Gail.
Yeah, Parker Posey, I think she's wonderful in this movie.
Yeah.
And they style her
because like when she gets it right, like because like, you know, a lot of the time she is sort of missing what we know Gail to be. You know, and so is just this other weird, wonderful presence in this movie. But occasionally she'll get it right, and then it's like there are two Gales in the movie, which is pretty amazing.
They style her to look exactly like Gail from Scream, and it is hilarious.
Yes.
And then I love that her big plan is that she's going to stick with Gail, because if the killer wants to kill someone, he's going to pick Gail over Jennifer.
Yes. That is like in the midst of the crazy circumstances that exist in this movie and in this franchise, like that kind of makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense, and I like the fact that Gail then makes fun of her for it.
Yeah.
And it's also nice to literally have Gail working with someone that she cannot stand.
Yes.
Like, we did not lose that antagonism sort of between Gail and Sydney. It just got transferred to someone else.
Yeah. Well, Parker Posey sort of fills in the role of her cameraman in the previous two movies. Mm-hmm. That she is sort of this person who's kind of tagging along / being dragged along by Gail, who's really just in way over her head.
Yeah, I was really hoping that Jennifer survived the movie, but she didn't.
Yeah.
R.I.P. Jennifer.
Stab 3 is just not going to be made, I'm pretty sure. A good deal of its cast and crew get off in this movie. Although I'm sure people would push for it to get made.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about Randy's guest appearance. We mentioned it up front.
Yes.
Poor Randy.
Again, the other two movies leaned pretty hard into the fourth wall with a lot of stuff, especially Randy's scenes. This takes the cake by a mile because everybody just drops what they're doing to sit down and listen to Randy give this speech, which cannot possibly have been intended to be directly applicable to anything they're dealing with, because he is in fact dead and recorded this before the last killer was caught, and yet are just taking his amateur film criticism as gospel advice for how to proceed in surviving this killing spree. You know, and they are right to do so, because Randy has been correct in every previous instance, because he is aware somehow that he is in a slasher movie franchise. It's just everybody buys it. It's one of those moments where I was just watching and I was like, what is this movie now? What is this franchise that it has become this? This is like Kaufman shit.
I have a certain softness for that scene because...
Oh, I love it. I love it. It's one of the best scenes in the movie, but it's just... Yeah. It's so out of left field even for these movies.
Well, one, I like the fact that it wasn't just like Randy's dead and we're going to ignore him for now or for the movie. That Randy is still very much a part of the survivors' lives, even if he is dead.
I like that a lot.
And like the acting is so good in that scene. If you sit there and watch Courtney Cox, David Arquette, and Nev Campbell, the acting is so good with it's just literally just them watching a videotape. But like you can see sort of the regret and how much they miss Randy and just laughing along with sort of his jokes. Like it isn't sort of a tear-jerking scene, but it does.
No, but it does feel really right for the relationship that those characters had. But yeah, it felt like his previous appearances were like, oh hey, we're gonna have a character who's really kind of knowledgeable about the tropes and conventions of slasher movies in this slasher movie, so that we can have some kind of cute jokes. Whereas like here it makes it seem like this is a character who has some kind of unexplainable awareness that they were in a movie or that the universe that they existed in was one that existed for a movie. Like it goes beyond like some kind of winks and nudges and goes into like Duck Amuck territory, or like the end of Blazing Saddles. You would have expected that if Randy was still alive in this movie, that when shit started to get heavy, he would just go and find Wes Craven and ask him what the hell he was doing. But it's terrifically entertaining.
Well, do you want to talk a little bit about the way that this movie expands Scream's backstory?
Yeah, I guess we should, since that ends up being the key to everything.
Yeah, Randy makes a big point about how you should be wary if you're turning up all sorts of previously unseen secrets about the past, which is, of course, what is happening.
Yes. Yeah, and especially about the events of the first movie, because it's all about tying it together.
They keep finding photographs of Maureen Prescott, who was murdered before the first movie even took place, from a period of her life that no one knows where she was. And it's sort of, in the first two movies, they were all centered around who the killer is, and that was the central mystery. In this movie, it's actually the central mystery is not who the killer is, but really what happened to Maureen Prescott during those 2 years.
Or they're at least given sort of equal time and consideration.
But yeah, and sort of over the course of the movie, they unravel that she was an actress who was going by the name Rena Reynolds, and she was starring, or maybe not even starring would be the correct word, but that she had acted in a couple of low-budget horror movies that were produced by a man named John Milton, who she went to a party at his house and she was raped, and then that caused her to go back to Woodsboro, get married, and sort of traumatized her for the rest of her life.
Yeah, this movie is actually pretty topical in 2017.
Yeah, and here's the thing about this, is that this movie was produced by Dimension Films, which Dimension Films was a subsidiary of Miramax, I believe is the correct relationship, which Miramax is obviously the Weinstein brothers film company. But Dimension was Bob Weinstein's film studio, where he made horror movies and sci-fi movies to keep them sort of separate from Harvey Weinstein's Oscar movies. And if you have been following sort of the Weinstein saga, Bob Weinstein...
Which is in its own way as riveting and horrifying as these movies.
Yeah. Bob Weinstein has had a very contentious relationship with his brother, fighting a lot, and there have been a lot of rumors that one of the reasons why the scandal broke was because of the fact that Bob Weinstein was trying to force Harvey Weinstein out. And it's fairly easy to read this movie as Bob Weinstein attacking, I guess would be the best word, Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah, and I don't know how much stock I would place in that, because who knows how much creative control he had over this. Wes Anderson strikes me as somewhat
Craven.
of an fuck. This Wes Anderson did not make this movie.
Yeah, we should probably, for future reference, you should probably never get a Wes Craven movie when you want a Wes Anderson movie.
No, don't do that.
Because you'll be showing your kids a stop motion movie about, trying to show your kids a stop motion movie about a mouse, and the next thing you know, people are going to be murdering each other in their dreams.
Yeah,
It'll be a bad time.
Yeah, it won't be good. I should have said, if I had said Wes Carpenter, that would have been good, because that would have been a callback to the first movie.
Yeah.
Which would be fitting for this. But yeah, no, Wes Craven strikes me as kind of an auteur type, who probably, again, as we pointed out, this is one of the only slasher movie franchises where the director of the initial movie has returned for all of the subsequent movies. So like this franchise is clearly his baby. Any and all themes and ideas that are present in the movies, I would tend to ascribe to him.
Yeah, and
Um,
it could very easily be Wes Craven commenting on sort of some of the stuff because again, Wes Craven has been associated with Miramax.
Yeah, and it could be that Wes Craven's relationship with Bob Weinstein might have been part of the motivation to make this movie the way that he did. There's a lot of stuff that could have gone on there, which I would say we'll never know. But given recent events, some of this stuff might be drudged up again.
I mean, I
Well,
certainly
we might be reading an interview with Wes Craven talking about how that's exactly what he was trying to do with this movie next week or so.
obviously this movie is sort of canary in a coal mine, if you want to take it that way, for what was going on with Weinstein's during this time. And I do think it is obviously way more relevant now than it probably was when it was released.
Yeah, which is not necessarily a thing to be happy about, but it does give this movie a really interesting edge revisiting it all these years later.
Yeah. Setting aside sort of its social relevance now, what did you think about sort of all this new backstory?
It's funny. This is sort of something that I might say a couple times about various things in this movie, which is funny considering Randy's little speech about how the last installment in a trilogy is supposed to tie everything together. A lot of stuff in this movie, I think, works better on its own than it does in relation to the other movies, like the prologue. Is what I was talking about. And like the backstory here, like the backstory that is revealed is cool, and it does fit with what's going on, and it does give us a good story for this movie, but it does feel a little weird to have it just kind of come out of the blue at this stage in the game. Even if that is, as Randy says, the way that trilogies are supposed to go, that in the third movie you learn all this new information and question stuff that you thought was certain. I get that, but it did feel, to me at least, it felt a little. It felt a little sort of out of nowhere.
Yeah, this is sort of, while I actually like the backstory of Maureen, this is sort of the centering of all the stuff that I think does not work in this movie. Like, I did not like Sydney's sort of dreams about Maureen.
Yeah, those were a little goofy.
And
We have all
ultimately,
the backstory with Maureen and what it means to Sydney as she hears about it. That stuff is fine. I was referring more specifically to the identity of the killer.
well, let's talk about the killer. The
Killer singular this time.
Yeah, were you surprised that there was a killer?
I was very surprised, actually. I was still waiting during the climax after he was unmasked. I was still waiting for the reveal of who the other one was because I just assumed. Yeah, and I was, but I was the guy who was expecting in Scream 2 that because the twist last time was that there were two. The twist this time is that there's going to be like 10 or something. So I'm not the best at reading these things.
All right. Well, the killer is Roman, the director of Stab 3. What were your thoughts about him? Was he ever sort of on your radar?
No. Well, yeah, no.
I feel like he's a little bit too much of a minor presence to really be a viable suspect.
Yeah. Well, and also like the last one or like all of them, I guess, but more particularly the second one. This movie leans pretty heavy on its red herrings.
Yeah.
Our red herring this time is Detective Kincaid. And last movie the red herring was Sydney's boyfriend at the time, whose name escapes me. And I told you when we recorded that episode, I laughed because there's a scene backstage after Sydney freaks out where he seems like he's being kind of sinister, and the music is playing up. It's like, see, you should be nervous about this guy. And then he walks away and he walks past a sign on the wall for like I don't even know what it is. There's like a transformer on the wall, but there's a sign that he walks past that says danger that the camera lingers on as he walks past. In this movie, Kincaid is talking to Sydney in his office, and as she starts to get suspicious of him because she knows that he used Dewey's phone, that scene is also makes sure that you catch that. She's talking to him about this, is starting to get a little suspicious of him. He seems like he's acting kind of creepy, and he stands up, and as he stands up, he reveals the piece of evidence that is pinned to the wall, to the board behind him, along with other stuff, which is the note that they found, which says, "I killed her."
Yeah.
I underlined. That is still just hanging there, and so as he gets up to pace sort of sinisterly around the room, he reveals that. Oh,
Yeah,
that
well,
that was too much for me.
what about the actress playing or who won the role of Sydney? Did you ever suspect her?
Well, I suspected her in that one scene,
Hmm.
which is that was a really good scene. I thought was the scene that they shared together,
Hmm.
where the actress was talking about wanting to make Sydney proud with her portrayal of her and wanting to legitimately understand her and be able to portray her. I thought that was really sweet. And I guess it makes sort of a counterbalance to all of the really kind of biting attitude that this movie has towards Hollywood. That it kind of throws in that scene, as most directors who want to take shots at their own industry often feel the need to include a little, that they often feel the need to include a little, but the art is still beautiful,
Hmm.
sort of moment. That it's, that the movie is like, well, no, making movies is still cool, it's still important, and it can still mean a lot to people. So I thought that was a nice thing to have in there.
But so our killer is Roman, the director, and Roman was the child of Marines from some of this rape by, at the very least, Milton, the producer, and possibly other people were involved, and she abandoned him.
Yeah. Oh, and I forgot to mention I'm shocked I say that a film director with the first name Roman turned out to be a horrible asshole.
Which again, that parallels sort of Billy's motivation from first movie because again, his motivation was that his mom abandoned him.
Oh man, I didn't even think about that. That's totally true.
But so he eventually found Maureen about a year or so before all of the events of Scream, and she completely rejected him out of hand and said Sydney was her only child. So then he filmed her having her many affairs and wound up showing the videotape to Billy to explain to him why his mom left, and then basically groomed him as a serial killer the way Mrs. Loomis groomed Mickey in Scream 2.
Were you following all that, listeners?
It's a little complicated.
Yeah, and just I guess that's what bothers me a little bit about it is that we're being informed, via exposition, via shout monologue about all of this stuff that happened during or just before actually first Scream movie, none of which we saw, none of which there was any hint towards, and so it feels a little easy. It definitely doesn't feel like something that was planned.
Yeah, no, I do not believe that any of this was planned.
Which is fine, but
To me, it feels very much like again, with trilogies, they want to bring it back to the first one. They wanted to insert Roman into the first one somehow. The only way they could come up with was that, oh, he showed Billy this videotape and sort of gave him a few pointers, which I don't think really works. I think Billy's motivation was fine on his own.
yeah.
And I think it just sort of awkwardly, again, jams Roman in that no one knew that sort of this adult Hollywood director, well, I don't know if he was a director at that point, but what had just somehow secretly gotten into contact or somehow secretly was talking to Billy and showing him videotapes, and it seems weird.
Yeah, and I think that's my biggest issue with the movie is that again the backstory as a story is fine, and Roman as a presence in the movie is fine. It's just sort of it just sort of feels a little spliced in without a lot of smoothing out the wrinkles.
I definitely don't think Roman was as delightful as a killer as Mrs. Loomis.
No, but that's a pretty high bar.
It is a very high bar. For anyone who wants to make a slasher movie out there, hire Laurie Metcalf as your killer.
Please do.
She is really good at that. But
Yeah, I thought he was suitably deranged. I thought he was. I guess maybe the weakest villain out of the three. Although, but Mrs. Loomis is still more fun to watch than Billy Loomis and the other guy. So I don't know.
there are really only a couple more things I'd like to focus on. One is that how fun was it watching Sydney being chased by the killer on those Hollywood sets?
Yeah, that was. Oh, and that was another moment I really liked is when she stumbled through the door and saw the set of her old house and kind of walked towards it. Like that felt really good. That felt like what Randy was talking about. That that the movie was going back to the start, going back to where it all began. That really worked for me in the end, and the whole sequence of her wandering around.
Yeah, well, I love how she forgets that she's on a movie set and keeps acting like she's in an actual house.
Yeah.
And it is really, really fun to sort of revisit sort of those spaces, but in this sort of completely artificial way. Like, I am incredibly amused by the set dresser putting up a giant Creed poster in her bedroom.
Yes. Yeah. I liked that a lot, and again, it felt, again, I'm consistently impressed with this franchise's way of being both really sincere and really meta. So that's a sequence where we're watching a slasher movie killer chase around a victim on the set of a slasher movie that is being filmed in the universe of the slasher movie that we're watching. But it still plays it sort of sincerely, and it's still a legitimately suspenseful scene. It's probably the most intense sequence in the movie.
And the killer pulled sort of a Russ Thorne in that he was pretending to be a dead body, waiting for her to stumble upon him.
Yeah, which is not quite as good as when he blends in with all of the costumes.
That was great. Jenny McCarthy's character's death is really good, particularly how she keeps trying to fend him off with props.
Yes, yeah, that she can't. But yeah, it's just rubber machetes and knives everywhere because
they're making the slasher movie, and so there are fake weapons everywhere, and she keeps grabbing them and trying to use them, and they of course don't work.
Her part in the movie was the source of the weirdest joke, I think, in the whole franchise, which is that she accidentally breaks the award trophy that belongs to Roman, and then he's griping about it later before we know that he's the killer, and he's wanting. I'm 30. I haven't gotten this project off the ground. I'm probably the next target. And they're like, why? And he holds up the headless trophy, and he's like, this doesn't look like a message to you, which has nothing to do with anything.
Well, I love the fact that Jenny McCarthy tries to fix it with tape.
Yes, with Scotch tape. And now that we know that he was actually the killer, like, we know that he didn't actually think that when he found it. He thought, that bitch broke my trophy just before I got here to kill her. Shit. And that was it. So there's no he was just fucking with those people at that moment.
Oh yeah. Well, what'd you think about Carrie Fisher?
Yeah. That's another person who's in this movie.
Again, it's really, really sad to now reflect on Carrie Fisher's cameo in this movie. But she is really good.
Well, Carrie Fisher is great in everything.
Of course she is.
That's just sort of a given. What are we going to say? Carrie Fisher wasn't great in this movie? That's a sentence nobody's ever said.
She's just so cynical and annoyed at Gail and Jennifer.
Yeah, and again, is another character who's just sick of the world of Hollywood, and is just really, really cynical and burnt out by it.
And there's that whole joke about how she auditioned for Princess Leia in Star Wars, and it went to Carrie Fisher, and it's just, it is.
If that conversation had continued because she said, okay, you want me to stand here and tell you who you look like? If that scene had gone on in that direction, and she said that she looked like Courtney Cox, then I might have started to get angry. Like, I might have that would have been the point of flying too close to the sun, I think.
It's not like this franchise has not made Friends jokes before, but like, at that point, yeah, it would have been way too much.
But yeah, I guess she probably has the best, the objective best cameo in the movie. As happy as I was to see Jane Silent Bob, and as happy as I always am to see Patrick Warburton, because he's one of my favorite living men, even though he's still playing basically the same kind of jerky Patrick Warburton character that he often does.
Poor Patrick Warburton, right before he dies, finds Dewey's hidden picture of him and Gail.
Yeah.
Dewey has a
his
heart.
last word is his stupid derisive nickname for Dewey. That he like stumbles out of the darkness, this dewdrop, and then collapses. It's got to be a disappointing way to go.
Well, it's less disappointing than Matt Kieslar's death, which is death by explosion.
Yeah. Death by explosion in midline.
Which he was warned, because Gail and Dewey told him that if the killer wants them to stay in the house, or if the killer tells them to stay in the house, they have to leave the house, and he did not listen.
Yeah, which everybody does in this franchise. Everybody, it's everybody just acts like everybody just decides to follow game show rules as soon as the killer calls them. They believe him when he's, we're gonna play a game, and if and follow the rules, and you play your cards right, you might survive. They just assume that he's being on the level with them, and that he isn't just gonna kill them, because it's not like he's a crazy killer or anything.
It is, well, the thing that I very much enjoy about it is the fact that Gale and Dewey definitely are not playing by the rules. Like,
Yeah, because they've lived through this shit too much.
yeah, and the people who live are the people who listen to the people who have already lived through this exact circumstance. Do you have any final thoughts on Scream 3?
Oh, yeah, again, I outlined my thoughts on the movie at the outset, that I think, I have problems with it, but the problems more have to do with its relation to the other movies than it on its own. And it is really cool, because I know that Scream 4 was made a lot later, and this was clearly intended to be the end of the franchise, which again Randy spells out pretty clearly for you. And so it's cool to sort of look at this franchise as a whole, and or at least this part of the franchise as a whole, that it does make a very good trilogy.
Yeah, do you like the way that this movie, the epilogue of this movie, where Gale and Dewey are getting engaged and Sydney has seemingly healed from her trauma?
Yeah. I think that was a fine place to leave these characters. And I'm still really interested to see how the fourth one revisits them. But it, unlike the first two, it does feel like this is a place that we could leave them forever, and that would be okay.
Like, this is as close to a happy ending as you could possibly leave these characters.
Yeah, and it ends, the last shot is a bit of a knife twist, but it's not the conventional horror movie kind of knife twist, which I thought was really funny, because that's something Wes Craven is kind of known for, and does sort of in particular showcase in this franchise, is that he doesn't, while he's clearly in love with the horror genre, and has become really great in that field, that there's a lot of conventions that he likes to mess with and subvert or sort of not do. And so I thought that it was cool that we get, because the last shot of the movie is the door behind Sydney opening on its own for some reason, and then we're looking at that shot, and the way that a more typical sort of dumb horror movie would end that there would be another killer that showed up there, and then smash cut to the credits. And so, like, it's lingering on that shot of just the open door for a couple seconds, and you're like, okay, are we going to get the conventional horror movie thing? And then smash cut to directed by Wes Craven. So you're like, oh no, of course we're not.
Yeah, I mean, it's A, shot like a horror movie, but B, is telling you that for these characters, as of this movie, there is no more killer. That they have resolved everything they need to resolve. Obviously,
but the door is still open for revisiting.
Yeah.
Which it did.
Yeah, which, I mean, obviously that doesn't last because there is a fourth movie. But again, thematically, as far as this movie is concerned, this was the last movie, and that this is and that these characters don't have to worry about a door creaking anymore.
Yes. So I thought that whole final sequence was a really great spot to end the franchise. And I like looking at the franchise as a whole. I like seeing some of the stuff that was a part of all three movies. I like that the killer has the same voice in all three movies. That I guess they all buy the same brand of non-existent live portable voice modulator, which is really cool, because it feels like, again, even though this being sort of the opposite of how typical slasher movies are, where the killer is constant and the survivors and victims keep changing, that in this one it's the same group of characters being menaced by different killers, but by giving them not just the same image every time but also the same voice, it really does feel like they're all sort of emblematic of the same thing, which is really cool. I like that Red Right Hand is used in all of them, which I pointed out last time. And this one has and I went and did research on it, because I was listening to it in the background. I was like, hey, it's this one again, and it sounded different, and there were lyrics I didn't recognize, so I looked it up. Apparently, he re-recorded a new version of it just for this movie. Nick Cave did, which is pretty awesome. It's pretty cool, since again that is sort of the unofficial theme music of this franchise. That was a cool gesture for him to make. yeah, it's a really cool, really solid trilogy as it stands.
I think there is a huge reason why Scream defined horror for this time period.
Absolutely.
It would eventually be sort of supplanted by the Saw movies, but these movies are so well constructed and the acting is so strong, the writing so strong. It defined horror, and it kind of in its own way defined film and left sort of a huge legacy that I don't think that many people really appreciate. Like, I think even more than horror, I think it had a much bigger impact on comedy. Like, I don't think people
Yeah,
would
which
be,
we've talked about.
yeah, like Community, Rick and Morty,
Yes.
Cougar Town, which also starred Courtney Cox. I think all this stuff is sort of building off of ideas that first were really brought into prominence by Scream.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. Which is weird because we talked about that with Carrie as well.
Mhm.
That Carrie had a bigger influence on genres other than its own.
There really aren't that many horror movies, and definitely not that many horror franchises where you can legitimately say, well, you know what, I love them for their characters. Because there's
Yeah,
usually,
certainly very few franchise horror movies.
which I mean, I can say that about Happy Death Day, for example, that I love it for its characters because their characters are so good. But
Yeah,
it might,
I would even tentatively say it about the first Halloween because I really like Laurie Strode and I really like Donald Pleasence's character,
mhm.
but
the
it's definitely a rarity.
in Halloween, sort of, you had obviously Laurie and Dr. Loomis, and then both characters vanish, and then Jamie, who was Laurie Strode's daughter, shows up for several Halloween movies, and then Laurie shows up again. You're not having sort of these consistent characters the way that Scream does.
Yeah, because nobody does that.
In Nightmare on Elm Street, Nancy shows up for a couple movies, but she's not in all of them, and like there are a couple other characters that will be there for a movie or two, but you aren't sort of having the degree of character work that Scream puts in.
Yeah, and this movie, the sequels in particular, like the sequels of this movie have a premise beyond, and then the guy from the first movie kept killing people. Good or bad, that is the premise of most slasher movie sequels. Going that extra mile and putting in all of that effort, putting all that effort into character and into structuring the story and into having it be sort of a consistent and continuous franchise, I think really paid off.
Yeah. All right, well, let's get to our final segment, Best Death. Who got the best death?
Ooh, I didn't think about it. Fewer people die in this movie than in the last two, I feel like.
Well, as much as I want to say Matt Kieslar's character in his explosion died the best death, I'm going to go with Roman because that is pretty
Yeah,
hilarious. Because
yeah, I think I'll join you in that.
he's wearing a bulletproof vest, and Dewey keeps shooting him and keeps shooting him and keeps shooting him.
And they're screaming at the head,
Yeah.
removing the head or destroying the brain. Everybody knows this. I guess they didn't in the night.
Poor Dewey. He was trying his hardest.
Yeah.
I
Well, that was something else I was gonna say. Is talking about how influential this movie was even beyond in the horror genre. This, like, I didn't live through most born in '97, but like my understanding of the time period, looking at these movies, like these movies are the '90s to me. Like this is aside from kind of the juvenile culture of the '90s, all of the extreme and skateboards kind of stuff, all of the stuff that was marketed to kids. Like to me, when I think of the '90s, and I'm not thinking of of 10 to 14-year-olds, like the way these movies look and the way that they feel, like that's sort of what I think of, which I think just speaks to the influence of the franchise and speaks to the grasp that it had on the spirit of the time.
Yeah, I mean, these movies aren't sort of timeless artifacts because obviously they don't exist in a world with cell phones, but they are very much period pieces, even if they were made contemporary, that they sum up, well, this is what life was like in this time period pretty well.
Yeah, exactly. And in a time period where we were more concerned with individual crazy people running around than administrations of crazy people threatening to blow each other up.
This is also taking place sort of in a pre-terrorism world, a pre-9/11 world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I meant. I phrased it sort of inelegantly.
Well, I thought you were talking about the Trump administration, or
I meant that as in general as well.
Yeah, because no one reacts to these killings the way they would react to similar circumstances post 9/11.
Yeah, it's pre 9/11. It's pre Columbine,
Mhm.
certainly. Yeah, it's interesting. It is sort of it harkens back to a time, and I guess a lot of 80s and 90s slasher movies do that, but this one just because of the feel that it has for the culture of the time, I would say more so. It harkens back to a time when it was still crazy and outrageous for some lunatic to start killing a bunch of people instead of something that everybody in the country was sort of cynically used to, which is kind of where we're at now. Which I guess is why most of the villains in horror movies these days aren't crazy killers; they're supernatural entities.
If this movie was screening now and it was analogous to It, do you think it would work like as, oh, this sort of flashback period piece?
I don't know. Maybe not because I don't know. I mean, it just so self-consciously paints itself top to bottom in the aesthetic of the time period that
Mhm.
it's setting itself in. And I think doing something like that to that level is something you can only do in retrospect. But I think Scream would come a lot closer to that than a lot of other movies and a lot of other movies from that time period.
Like, I think these movies are classics for a very good reason, and they stand up. And, well, obviously, I love them, so I'm biased. So, all right. Well, I guess it's time to say goodbye. So, once again, make sure that you are not answering your landlines because you don't know who's on the other end. And there's a 90% chance if someone's calling you a landline, it's either someone looking for money or it's a serial killer.
Why do you even have a landline? Get rid of it. I was speaking to the listener there. I wasn't accusing you.
My parents have a landline. My parents have a landline, and they keep their cell phone turned off at all times.
They're doing that wrong.
Yeah,
that is that is the exact wrong way to go about both of those things.
yeah, I know. When I'm at work and I want to tell them something that would normally take like a text, it winds up being this huge production of like going to sort of a hidden or going to an area where I can have some privacy and then calling them and then hoping they answer and then if they don't answer, leaving a message. And I'm like, wow, people used to do this.
Yeah, that's crazy that we're living in a time where like, oh man, people used to go through all of this archaic shenanigans surrounding home phones. We're living in Star Trek times.
We really are. But all right, so join us next week, which will not be Scream 4, but we will be doing Scream 4. You can bet on that. And have a great
Yeah.
night. Bye bye.
So long.